Today I'm going to work on a project where I'm doing some seaming, and I wanted to go ahead and show you some differences here. This is going to be an Afghan, and I'm knitting these triangles, and then I'm sewing the triangles together in order to make an Afghan. So when I first started this, I decided I was just going to use a crochet hook and crochet the edges. And it's a neat seam, but the thing I didn't like about it is that when I open up the triangle, you can see each one of my stitches. You can see the brown color coming through on each one of those stitches. I didn't like that. So after I had done several seams that way, on this last one, I decided instead of using a crochet hook that I would just use the mattress stitch, which is a stitch you use when you're seaming two pieces of knitting together. It makes a seam that is neat on the edge. You can't see the brown yarn, and it does make a different looking seam than this, but you again can't see the brown yarn. If you peel this back, you can see the brown yarn there, and if you pull this back, you can see the brown yarn on this side. But it does make a seam on the back, but I think I could live with this seam more than I could live with this seam. So I'm going to eventually rip these out and redo them, but I'm going to go ahead and put the next triangle on, and I thought I would show you how I'm doing that. So this blanket that I'm making, I'll have a link to it in the description below. So this is a pattern I got from the Lion brand website. It's a free pattern for this Afghan, and you make these series of triangles. Some are left shaped triangles and some are right shaped triangles. So sometimes the slope is on this side and sometimes the slope is on this side. So I have done these, worked these with a slipped stitch edge. So I slipped the last stitch of every row, which created a nice edge, and I'm going to use those slipped stitches for my seaming. I have that on both sides, slip stitch edge, kind of leaves these big holes, which is where my needle is going to start going through to pick up the bars in between the rows that I'm going to use to do the seaming. So I'm going to show you here before I put these squares or triangles together. I'm going to kind of show you what I'm looking for when I start these seams. When I was crocheting them, I was going into the stitch this way, and I was picking up the V, which is the slipped stitch. I was picking up the V and seaming those together to the V's on the other triangle. And I think that's why it didn't look good to me. It was because these slip stitches do create a bit of a hole in your work, and you could really see that brown yarn. So I wasn't happy with that. But I want to continue doing this slip stitch edge because I just like the finished look, even though they're going to butt up against each other. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to attach the next in the series is a colorful one. In this blanket there are some triangles that are neutral colors, browns, grays, blacks, and then there's some triangles that are colorful. So I'm going to attach my colorful one next. So there, my point is going to happen there, and my point is going to happen here. So to get started, I lay it out the way I want it, make sure everything fits, and my right sides are facing up, and I want to start stitching this. And in order to do that, the best way to do that is I want my right sides to be facing out and my wrong sides to be facing each other. So when I pick this up to start my seaming, I'm going to pick up and pinch this edge and I'm going to pick up and pinch here, because this is how I'm going to hold it when I sew. My right side is here, my right side is there. The wrong sides are facing each other. So I'm going to zoom this in just a little bit, and I'm going to start a few stitches. It's going to be a little harder to see because this is some dark triangle yarn here, that's dark purple, and then my seaming yarn is brown, but I think you'll be able to see the technique. So let me get this yarn on my needle, and I'm going to start seaming these together. I'm going to go into this. I'm not going to go into the very first slip stitch. I'm not going to tie a knot there. I'm going to go in just a little bit below it. Just a little bit below it. Pull the yarn almost all the way through. Same thing over here. I'm not going to go into my very first slip stitch. I'm going to go just a little bit below it. Now some people, when they're seaming, they don't like to have knots in their work. I don't mind having knots, tying pieces together where I know it's not going to come loose. So I'm going to just real quickly do an overhand knot. I'm going to leave a long enough tail that I can seam in later. I can weave this tail in. But I'm just going to do just a quick little snug knot. Now I'm going to start my seaming. So what I'm going to do, like I showed you before, is there's my first slip stitch edge. So I'm going to pick up, I'm actually going to start back here where my yarn is tied together. I'm going to go into that same exact hole where my yarn's coming out of, and I'm going to pick up that first row, which is right there. That first row. It looks like a little V on my needle. That's the very first row. Now I want to pick up the second row. There's the first row. If I kind of pull this out and put my finger behind it, you might be able to see it. It's kind of hard to see. Let me pull it over here on the white fabric. The second row is right there. You'll see it a little easier as I go here. Let me just get started. I picked up 2 rows on this side, and I'm going to go pick up 2 rows on this side. I'm going to go into the hole where my brown is coming out of. Again, it's easier for me to see this than it is for you off on the camera because of the dark colors, but I've picked up 2 rows on that side. I'm not going to pull tight just yet. I'm going to seam up several rows before I pull tight. I'm going to go into the same hole where my brown is coming out of, and I'm going to pull up 2 rows. There's a row. There's my first row. There's my second row. Let me show you how I'm finding these. If I show you over here on the white where you can see the holes, see there's holes, there's a hole, there's a hole, there's a hole. I'm looking for the little V that's in between each one of those slip stitches. So there. So that's what I'm looking for. So I'm going to go into the hole where my yarn was coming out of. There's the first one. There's the second one. A little hard to see on the purple, but trust me, I'm picking up 2 rows. Once I get past this dark purple, it'll be a little bit easier to see. Go into the same hole where the brown's coming out of. There's the first one. There's the second one. You can see that this garter stitch ridge and this gray garter stitch ridge, I'm going underneath where the garter stitch ridge fits against the slip stitch edge. And I do 2 rows at a time. I do two rows from this side, go back and do 2 rows from the next side. You can see the 2 bars. There's a bar for the cream color, and there's a bar for the gray color. I'm going to do 1 or 2 more, and then I'll tighten the row and show you how they tighten. I've just gone 2 more rows here. Go in where the brown left off. There's a bar, and there's a bar. There's a bar, there's a bar. There's a bar, there's a bar. Alright, now that I've gone several stitches on both sides, you can see I kind of have a lace up, like shoes is laced up. And now I'm going to pull this seam together. I'm going to pinch my yarn where my knot is, and I'm going to take this thread that's my sewing yarn, and I'm going to pull it. I don't want to pull it tight enough to where my yarn wants to break, but I do want to pull it kind of snug, and I push against where I'm pinching, and that tightens up the seam. So you can see it makes for a real nice, very smooth seam on the back. You can see my seam forming. You can't see the brown yarn unless you roll it back. The brown yarn is in that fold. So I'm going to continue on. I'm going to do a little bit more. You can see it easier when I'm on this lighter side. Again, let me just show you. You can see that slip stitch edge. There's one, there's one, there's one. You can see that slip stitch edge, and you can see that little bar in between those slip stitches. That's the little bar that I'm catching each time. You can see each stitch ends right where there's a little bar. So I'm going to continue on. I'm going to go into the hole where my brown left off. There's a bar, there's a bar. As you can see, I've sped up the video just to save some time. I continue doing the 2 rows at a time all the way up. I stop every now and then to tighten up the seam. And I make sure as I go that my points at the end will still come together. You can see occasionally I made a mistake where my yarn didn't come through right up against the slip stitch. So I undid it and made sure that instead of my needle coming up 1 stitch over, I took it out and made sure that my needle was coming up right against the slip stitch. I think I made that mistake 2 or 3 times as I went up the edge. Just remember to keep looking at those garter stitch ridges. Kind of helps you as a guide to know that you're on the right track. And here again, I went 1 stitch in rather than right up against the slip stitch, so I'm taking that out. It's always better to go ahead and fix it while you can rather than to go past it and have your seam finished and then you see it, because that would drive me nuts. One, two. One, two. And when I get here to the end, it's kind of always hard to match up exactly. So sometimes I have to kind of fudge it. Like where this yarn is coming out of, I want to make sure that this last stitch over here is coming out right about the same place, so that my very final stitch brings the ends, the very last. I want that very last square edge to match with the very last square edge of my brown. I'm going to stop and pull my seam. I'm going to pull it this way so I don't have any puckers. There's my last 2 stitches coming together, and this is how I do this last little bit. I come in underneath this side again, pull it kind of tight. On this side, I will pick up where this seam is coming together. I'll pick up a couple of threads there, and then I put a knot here. So I go around my needle twice and pull it through, because I want a little knot right there where the 2 are coming together. I want a knot there to help hold that seam secure. So there's a little knot, and I pull it kind of tight so I know that knot is secure. And now I go ahead and bury this edge into this seam where you're not going to be able to see it. So I'm going to go ahead and do that real quick. I just kind of whip stitch it in there. I'm not going into my knitting, I'm going into the seam, so you won't be able to see it. So I go about 4 or 5 stitches in this way. Then I go the other direction about 4 or 5 stitches. Since this is brown yarn and I'm going into a brown yarn, you're not going to see this seam at all. You want to go 2 ways, down and back, when you're burying your ends. You can go 3 ways if you want. The more ways you go, the better. Kind of pull it snug, kind of pinch it here with my thumb because I don't want to pull too tight, but I pull it snug. I've gone 2 ways, 1 way and down, and now I can cut that yarn. So that end is now buried in that seam. So now when I pull this back, you can see I have a nice seam. Comes together nicely here, comes together nicely down here, and the seam lays flat. You cannot see the brown stitches. It's a nice seam, and on this side I have a nice seam. It's flat. So I hope that's helped you. That's how I do my mattress stitch. If you have any questions or comments, leave those below in the comments. Again, I will put a link to this pattern in the description, so if you want to try knitting it, it's free download. this pattern, I'll show you a picture of it, but you can look this up online. This pattern does have a series of neutral color triangles and bright colored triangles, and this is what it'll look like when I'm finished. Everything about this pattern appeals to me. I like geometric shapes, so putting these triangles together into diamonds I think looks so cool. And then I also am drawn to stripes, so I love the striping. I'm kind of putting my stripes random. They were a little more disciplined in doing every triangle exactly the same, but I kind of just like free-forming it, so you can do it whatever you want to do. But you can see here it's the bright color triangles are paired up and the neutral colored triangles are paired up. And I think when I'm completely finished, I'm going to pick up stitches along each side, and I'm going to do a little bit of a border so that I don't have a ragged edge, because the way this ends, it's kind of a ragged edge, and I just don't think that looks as neat. It's fine, but I think just for my own personal satisfaction, I'm going to go back in at the end and pick up stitches all along that edge, and I'll knit a few rows probably of just plain garter stitch, same thing as here. I'll probably use this dark brown or some darker color. I'll pick up stitches along that edge and just do 5 or 6 ridges of garter stitch and then bind off, and I think that'll really set it off. It'll have a nice bound off edge that looks like that. I think it'll make for a nice blanket. So anyway, 48 triangles to complete this blanket, and I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 triangles together and 1 triangle yet to put on. So I've still got a lot of triangles to make. So once again, thank you guys for watching. I appreciate the comments people leave for me. I will see you next time. Bye.